Today's workshop is entitled, Another World is Possible. But in fact, we're already in that other world, and it's not the world of our own choosing. It's the world of climate change. I was in Rio in 1992, and at that time, all the world's leaders were saying, we have to act now. This is happening right now. We have to do something. It's really serious. And that was 20 years ago. And since then, the evidence has continued to mount that climate change is accelerating. It's certainly caused by greenhouse gas emissions from our industry and our agribusiness and our fossil fuel addicted society. And every year and every international meeting, our leaders keep pushing the issue off to the next year and the next international meeting, to sometime in the future. Well, the future is now. And we're in a struggle for the survival of the Earth as we know it. And the governments and the corporations who keep punting this issue into the future are condemning our children and our grandchildren to an absolutely unlivable world. So that's why we formed Climate Action, because we want to begin in a small way to start a dialogue here in Brooklyn about climate change and to start educating people about climate change and what its impact is going to be on the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where people are directly facing climate change impacts, particularly in places like Red Hook and Sunset Park. And we believe that another world is possible, a sustainable world, one where everyone has enough to eat and shelter and clean water. But it's going to be up to us to make it happen because our leaders are not.
Now, one thing we can say is business as usual is not an option. When we hear about various green initiatives, whether they be in energy or transport or in energy conservation, we cannot afford to lose sight of the fact that the emissions trajectories of the world are going in the wrong direction. They continue to go up, not down. The International Energy Agency's report that was released in November 2011, normally a conservative body, basically said that the scenario we face globally is no global climate agreement this side of 2020. And why should it be any different in 2020 is a good question we should be asking. And secondly, massive amounts of new fossil fuels coming online domestically and globally to meet rising energy demand. They have said that if this scenario unfolds in the way it looks like it's unfolding, then we have what they call dangerous carbon lock-in and the climate stabilization targets that have been agreed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as the minimum that are needed will not be reached. So we have a planetary emergency in front of us. And it requires, I think, the kind of policy proposals and organizing and movement building that are commensurate to the challenge and to not lose sight of the fact that we need those kind of fundamental changes. Let's please forget about peak oil, peak coal, and peak gas. This is not where the data is pointing right now. Yes, the OPEC, the traditional oil wells, are in decline. They've peaked, they're falling. But new forms of fossil fuels are coming into the system, whether it be in shale gas, whether it be in tar sands with bitumen, or whether it be in surface coal. The Wyoming Powder River coal bed is 10,000 square miles of coal, and according to the International Energy Agency, we have 1 trillion tons of economically viable coal in the world today. And my main message is that we have to put back into the political discourse the issue of public ownership of power generation as part of the process to get a climate-friendly energy system established in the decades ahead. The other reason for public ownership is the sheer scale and speed of the energy transition that's needed. It's not going to happen by, although it's hugely important to have the kind of things being discussed by Lisa, the fact that people are taking decisions, consumers are making decisions about how to use renewables, all of that is important. But if we have to be honest, we're talking about emissions reductions trajectory in the US and globally that is so steep that the only way you're really going to be able to do it is by having it a planned process, a democratic process with everybody and all stakeholders involved. And the best entities to do that are not private corporations, many of whom, as I've just described, are completely opposed to that transition anyway, but through a public process, through stakeholders and public ownership. Now, why public ownership then? Why should this be part of the solution? And I would put out a challenge to the audience. Is there another solution? And have we seen any evidence that this can be done differently? When we say public ownership, it doesn't need to be the kind of traditional nationalization of the past, although I think there's a lot to be said for that model, frankly, given the severity of the crisis. It could also be combined with community-based power, the idea that individuals can generate power through solar, through wind, at the local level. If we look at the investment levels, one of the reasons why renewable energy cannot compete with fossil fuels is the price. So then the issue comes, the liberal policy groups say, what we've got to try to do is lower the price, and we can do that through taking the subsidies away from fossils, maybe subsidize and give grants and incentives to renewables. All very good. But the private capital markets consider renewable energy to be a risky proposition. And when they lend to renewable companies, they lend at a high level of interest rates. And because of these high interest rates, the high price of renewables gets locked into the delivery. And so therefore, some of the prices are artificially inflated, don't reflect the real cost, but reflect the cost of the capital up front. When you look at countries who have managed to solve this problem, China, Germany, Denmark to some extent, they don't have that problem. So that's why in Germany you see a much higher penetration of renewables, and also in Denmark. They also don't have another problem, and that is NIMBYism. One of the problems wind in particular has in New York State and other parts of the world has a problem is that if you have land and you put up a few windmills or you lease it out or loan it out, you're the one who benefits, not the whole community. A multinational may come in and set up a wind farm on someone else's land. You get the negatives of seeing the windmills or hearing the noise, but the benefits only go to the company or the farmer or the landowner. So the Danish model, right from the very beginning, was to embed wind power into the communities, and the benefits would go back to the communities. It's a whole different approach, whereby if you see a windmill down the street, you can actually say, well, that's helping us produce renewable energy. The benefits come to our community. That's the approach, the best antidote to NIMBYism. It's not going to happen, though, unless there's more public ownership of power generation in the United States. Now, my last couple of points is on more on what does it mean for activism. Because we've seen, and I've been encouraged no end by the activism around the Keystone XL pipeline was phenomenal. The fracking movement, which is global, the anti-fracking movement. There was an article in the Financial Times just a few days ago that said, how can Bulgaria ban fracking? These people are stupid. They have to rely on Russia for their power. But the people of Bulgaria understand what fracking means. And that's true now in France and in other countries. So the movement against fossil fuels is encouraging, it's growing, but it needs to, in my view, embed into its arguments the need for public ownership of fossil fuels, of the deposits, of the power generation. Everything about the power generation system needs to be publicly owned. If it is publicly owned, if we can reach that and embed that into our activism, our possibilities for planning a transition from fossil fuels to 100% renewable power with community-based power fully scaled up to the max to invest in the technologies involved, those possibilities become imaginable. They are not imaginable if we leave that power in the hands of the fossil fuel corporations. So why not, as we take up these challenges against the fossil fuel industries, gas, coal, tar sands, oil, why not bring that into the discourse? Why not offer that as a solution to the climate crisis? The final point I would say is that the time, I believe, has come for us to raise the level of urgency, but also the level of ambition and confidence of what we can accomplish as a climate movement in combination and in alliance with other social movements. Let's fight for the kind of incremental policies we need. Let's do what we can as individuals, but we cannot lose sight of the scale and magnitude of the challenge before us and the scale and magnitude of the policies that are needed to meet that challenge. So I'll stop with that.
I think if we're looking at 10 years, what can we accomplish in 10 years, just to take that time span? And where do we see the paths of least resistance for change? Where are the leading institutions? Internationally, there'll be no agreement. Nationally, our Congress is deadlocked. The leading initiatives are being taken by cities worldwide. New York City is a member of C40. Cities Mayor Bloomberg is actually president at this time. Global cities are the units of government now that are taking leadership in all areas of sustainable urbanism, including what you would call decarbonization. Why? Because first, urban populations are progressive. We understand the essential role of government. Secondly, cities have been called the first responders to climate change. When we look at how many cities are coastal cities. I was recently at a screening of The Island President, in which former President Mohammed Nasheed reminded us, he said, you too are an island. And we're 1.5 meters above sea level, so are you. I'm assuming he's referring to lower Manhattan. But we are an island, Manhattan is anyway. But we share a commonality with the Maldives, which is risk from sea level rise. So if we're looking at 10 years, my approach would be, where do we see the most initiative? What can be accomplished within the shortest period of time? One would be all the initiatives being taken by global cities, climate action plans worldwide. City by city, there are climate action plans that are being developed. I recently spoke at Pace University in Westchester, and I looked up their climate action plan. So if you just Google climate action plans, you'll see small towns, large cities, coastal cities are all developing their climate action plans that are very comprehensive. They include mass transportation. This is where you can make the most progress in the shortest period of time. And institutions, schools, colleges. I teach a course at NYU called Green Design, the Future of Organizations, and we look at green design very broadly to encompass products and how all institutions can reduce their ecological footprint. So if we begin with the individual, there are measures we can all take to reduce our ecological footprint through our consumer patterns, which includes food. Climate change is now very clearly affecting food security, as it's called, including in the United States where crop yields are diminishing. And recently in the New York Times there was a report about how corn productivity, corn yields, corn prices will increase as a result of extreme weather. And there was one line that said, and in the future, corn will have to move northward to Canada. So what happens to the Midwest? Problem number one is our entire food supply system. So we can make a difference through our consumer patterns individually. But all of us in some way are embedded in a community, whether it's faith-based organizations, institutions, schools, places of work. Colleges like NYU have climate action plans. I'm on the Energy and Water Working Group. So all colleges, if they don't already have one, and if you work in a college, you can advocate for climate action plans and sustainability in terms of the operations of the college, which include green procurement. Procurement is key because institutionally you can leverage products that have a smaller ecological footprint. For example, we have mandated 30% recycled paper. You can mandate sustainable products, and you can achieve economies of scale because, as was pointed out, one of the problems with sustainable products is that you internalize what economists call externalities, or I prefer the term true social cost. So a sustainable product costs more precisely because it is not produced in an environmentally destructive way. So we can reward sustainable companies by requiring purchasing through procurement. And anyone who works in an institution can ask what the procurement policies are of that institution. So I'm suggesting look at what you do individually, but look at what institution you are part of and ask, do they have a climate action plan? Do they purchase energy they can get through RECs, wind power? What kind of procurement policies do they have? And then also lobbying for changes at the city and state level.
The public opinion surveys of the most unpopular industries in the United States did 10 economic sectors, and guess which one was the most unpopular? The oil companies and the energy companies are the most unpopular. Less unpopular than the public utilities because everybody thinks that's where your electricity comes from. But the oil companies are considered to be profiteers, speculators, polluters. And if there was a movement against those companies to clean them up, to transform them, that movement, I believe, if it was part of the work we're doing, gather some steam. Maybe not immediately, but over a period of time. Secondly, those oil companies made, and hear me, $1 trillion in profits. According to Senator Markey's report, from the year 2000 until now, $1 trillion in profits. Those profits, if there was public ownership, would be immediately in the public purse, not the country, but the public purse, and then can be used to invest in, won't be the only amount of money we need, but to invest in a renewables-based future. And that would be largely driven by conservation, but also decarbonization of power generation. It'll take a few decades, but with that revenue, that kind of revenue, we can begin to make an impact.
Do we have anybody in Congress or upstate or anywhere right now who is willing to risk Citizens United calling them a socialist for publicly owned utilities?
A couple of things. The problem of socialism and being labeled socialism, it's not a small problem. I'm not going to pretend that it is. But the issue, though, is look at what the under 30 generation, it's a completely different connotation. Asked whether they had a favorable view of socialism or not, I think over 50%, or roughly 50% of the people under 30 in the United States, and certainly more globally, have a positive view of it. They don't actually know exactly what it is. They probably, could easily be dissuaded from that position, but let's work with what we've got. The other thing is so I think that if we're going to be hamstrung by the problem of the word socialism, what it means in the American political culture, we have to then throw the question back and say, well, what's your solution then to the environmental and the energy and the climate crisis? If you've got a better solution, what's the capitalist solution? Haven't we tried that since Rio 1992? Isn't it all been about green capitalism since then? And what we've seen is emissions globally going up, fossil fuels going up, renewables going down or not growing up fast enough to have much of an impact on the global energy system. So I think that's how we got to be much more willing to confront that truth and put forward a solution. They can call it socialism if we want. We might want to call it something different, community-based power or public and socially owned energy. It can have a different meaning. A couple very quick points. When Obama administration bailed out the big three auto companies, the bailout was bigger than the market value of those three companies on Wall Street. It was bigger. Why couldn't they say, well, for the foreseeable future, the big three, in order to preserve jobs, we are putting it under trusteeship, under public trusteeship. Why couldn't they have done that? Would there have been demonstrations in the streets opposing Obama? If it was presented as a way of, that now we have an auto industry that we will preserve, and over the next decade or two, we will produce electric vehicles, we will produce fuel-efficient vehicles, the best available technologies. We would at the same time try to reduce the vehicle miles traveled on the roads today, clean up the trucking fleet. What if they had a very ambitious plan that people could relate to? You wouldn't get any resistance from the United Auto Workers. They've been losing so many members in the last 20, 30 years that they would have actually probably supported plan. I know that for a fact. The banks, similarly, we bailed out the banks, but if we had banks run like public utilities instead of big commercial operations, we would have the capital available to make the kind of transitions we're talking about. Let them call it socialism. If we can't defend socialism as a word because of its historical legacy, we can defend the concept of public power and democracy, and that's, I think, what we should be leading with.
Some of you may be aware of the concept of cradle-to-cradle closed-loop design. It means that we imitate nature. Biomimicry is a concept of innovation inspired by nature. In nature, there's no waste. Anything that dies and decomposes is the basis for new life. There's a concept of product design that's been around about 20 years. The book is called Cradle to Cradle, in which you design products so that there's as little waste as possible, recycling, reusing. What would otherwise go to landfill becomes a nutrient for another product. But now the new innovation is the concept of the circular economy, where you apply closed-loop product design to the entire economy. How can we interlock products, companies, so that there's very little waste? An aluminum can, for example, if you recycle one aluminum can, you save 95% of the energy to produce that can. There are initiatives by companies where they will recycle containers. Some are mandated by law. They're called take-back laws. Others are voluntary. And so what's otherwise would be destined for landfill becomes the basis of raw materials for another company. So what I'm saying is, if we're looking at 10 years, transforming relations of ownership and production is a long-term goal, which I would support, because capitalism has been based on growth, expansion, the concept of limitless uses of resources. But now we're realizing it's a finite planet. 1972 was the year of publication of Limits of Growth. The updated version of that is a new website, also I'd recommend, by the Stockholm Resilience Center. Planetary boundaries. They've outlined 9 planetary boundaries in which we have to live, and concluded we probably already surpassed 3: climate change, biodiversity, and nitrogen inputs to the biosphere. So my response would be, yes, long-term, I support that. But short-term, look at where you can accomplish the most strategically. Place your energy. We have limited time. That's why I don't think a carbon tax is useful to pursue at the congressional level. It won't be achieved. It doesn't have the effect that its adherents claim. The cost is passed down to the consumer. I think it's much more effective to call for mandates in renewable energy.
We also need massive energy conservation. One of the major savings for emissions, and costs for that matter, is by having radical energy conservation in buildings, both new buildings and existing buildings. How can that happen? One of the liberal groups tend to look at the price mechanism. If electrical power was expensive, then people would invest more in energy conservation. We assume that everything has got to have a price. And of course it does in a certain sense. If you're going to generate electrical power, it needs an infrastructure, it needs transmission lines, it needs stuff. And someone's got to pay for that. So to say that it's free is not what we're talking about. But one of the problems we've got with price, first of all, is the liberalization of energy markets, is the competition between different types of energy, which means that our future is determined on how cheap it can be. And that's a big problem. We wouldn't go into a candy store with our kids and say, and the kid would say, Mommy or Daddy, you know, there's poison candy on the aisle over there, and there's healthy candy on the aisle over there. What should we buy? And the parent wouldn't say, well, get the cheapest, honey. You know, like, it's cheap for a reason. A, it's subsidized. A, the externalities get unloaded onto society. But at the end of the day, price should not determine the energy future of the planet. And we need to control what I call social pricing. Yes, there needs to be price. We need to pay for it. But it doesn't mean to say that the more we sell of electrical power, the more money is accumulated to those who do the selling. I think that makes no sense whatsoever. In health, it's the difference between prevention and cure. If we can stop someone getting sick, as in stop someone using electrical power, we're doing better. The social benefits and the personal benefits are far greater than if we cure or try to attack a disease once it's started, which is going to cost you a lot more money. It's a concept, but it's one that I think we can work with. But get away from the issue of how do we make, and this is my pushback to the liberal conversation, is that how do we make renewables cheap so that people will buy it? That is not the issue.
People will die, and they will die in the hundreds and the thousands unless we do something, unless we prepare those neighborhoods, and unless we start taking action right now to start A, mitigating climate change, and B, putting up protective measures. In London, in St. Petersburg, in other countries around the world, they have these giant gates that hold back the flood waters. We have done nothing in New York, absolutely zero on that respect, and yet we have at least 4 neighborhoods in New York City that are going to be hit by these 20-foot wave surges. We have to start becoming aware at the national level, and we have to do that locally around fracking, but nationally we have to stop the tar sands because it is a huge, huge emitter of CO2. It's on a massive scale. We have to stop drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. There are plans to drill in the Arctic. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. There is no other word for it. The mines that Sean mentioned out in Wyoming, these are deep mines that are causing collapses on a massive scale. We cannot afford this kind of destruction of our environment. We are being turned into an extractive industry-based third world country. And until we decide to wake up and do something about that and realize that climate change, we are a peace group. Climate change drives war, and war drives climate change. They are absolutely connected. So as peace activists, we must join with the younger generation of environmental activists and really get out there and fight like hell for our planet.